Greetings, traveler. In a previous video, we discussed about how we can easily distribute power over various abilities that the player character has in our game. I will link this video down below if you haven't checked it out yet, but today what we're doing is answering the question that the traveler Greeny Neko asked, and he asked, I like this in general, but how does one handle adding new skills later on down in development or post-release? What if the player unlocks new skills while leveling? These are very good questions. As game designers, we will definitely come up to these situations predictably in every game we developed. So today what I want to do is first of all give you a quick recap of the method we discussed last time for distributing power over various skills that the player has. And then I'm going to talk about the hard mode of answering these questions. So let's say that you have to distribute power to new skills later on while leveling up or post-release and so on. What's the difficulty of dealing with this situation typically? And finally, I'm going to give you my easy mode answer for how to quickly and easily handle these situations, since basically we have all the tools available to be able to tackle that really easily. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now, and dealing with that specific question of how much damage something should have is something that I struggled a lot in my career. I spoke about it in the previous video that I'll link. I couldn't find a good enough answer from my colleagues or from resources on the internet or books and so on. So I developed this system to keep myself sane and be able to explain in a more academic style way why a certain power should have a certain attack value associated with it and so on, and also to make balancing of the game much easier. So let's give first a quick recap of the method we discussed last time for distributing power over various abilities that the player has. So we spoke about a sample ninja game, and we said that in our sample ninja game the main character has 4 attacks, and these 4 attacks are here. They are the punch, kick, shuriken, and sword attacks. So these are the attacks we discussed last time, and we said that well, one really easy way that I use is say from 100%, which is the total power distributed over all of the player's attacks, then it's up to us as the game designers to decide what story we want to tell with our game. So this is very important to keep in mind, because many times when that question comes up of how much power something should have, it feels like the math or the data of the game has more power over the final values than the game designer himself or herself, right? Which is not the case. It is the other way around. You always decide what to show to the player over time and so on. So it's up to you as the game designer to decide where you want to distribute the power, what story you want to tell, what you want to make strong and weak. In a sense, you control the meta 100%. So there is no how much something should be. It's always a case of how much do you want it to be. What do you think would make the best experience for the player? What would make the coolest game or the coolest way to distribute these abilities for the player to experience? So continuing with that way of thought, we said that from all the possibilities that we could possibly go with, for that sample game we said, well, what if we just give 10% of the power to the punch attack and then 25 to the kick to show that the kick is stronger than the punch, and to the shuriken let's give just 5 to show that yes, it's cool that it can shoot far, but it doesn't do so much damage. But what we want to highlight is that the sword is actually the strongest attack that the player has. If the player uses his sword attack as much as possible, then he should have the easiest time navigating the game. That should be his strongest attack. That is what we want to show with this power distribution. We want to show specifically, deliberately, that this character, when he uses a sword, he's at his strongest. There is no reason why we have to do it this way. It's just a choice. We could very easily make a different character in the game who is better with punches and kicks, for example, rather than the sword. So this is up to our freedom to decide what we want to show. So what would be then the hard mode of answering the question that Greeny Neko has? How would we be able to distribute power over time? So when the player levels up and gets new abilities, or we release a DLC down the track and we want to add new abilities, or post-development, as a patch or something, or as a free LC, we release some new abilities, and then we have to decide an attack value for those as well. How would we tackle that? The hard mode of answering this is being a slave to the math and being a slave to data, and feeling that somehow you are obliged to derive an answer based on these values. That is not the case. You still have all the power in this matter, because you are still the game designer and you get to decide what you think would be most fun for the player to experience. So you look at the data, you look at how players interact with the game, you look at what the game has and features already, and you decide the next steps to make the game even more fun and have even more content than before. So I will separate the easy mode of dealing with this in two sections, because realistically when we're working on games, there's these two different situations we might find ourselves into. The first one is about being able to pre-plan what abilities the player will unlock when he levels up, or when there's a DLC on, and so on. So we decide beforehand what we want to show the player later on down the track, even if it's not unveiled to the player right now. And the other approach is the not pre-planned. So this is the case where, let's say you released the game, but you didn't know that if you're going to be making additional content for it. One day you decided to do so, or the studio boss said, hey, this game sold a lot, let's make a DLC. Something like that. And even though you weren't originally planning on making these extra abilities, now you're certainly planning to make them, and now you have to make them. So how can you easily deal with that situation? All right, let's jump in and let's look at the pre-planned version first. So what we have here is we have our previous attacks, but let me move this a little bit. We have our previous attacks, which is the punch, kick, shuriken, sword, which we had already made up values, but now we decided that later on the player also discovers the nunchak attacks and the kusarigama attacks. So this can be it can be any version of overtime power up that you want. It could be that when the player levels up, he discovers these abilities, or when the first patch is released, these are unlocked, or with the first DLC, you also make these available to the player. It doesn't really matter, because it is your choice to say when these are unlocked and how much power they will have when they are unlocked. So you still have all the deciding power on this. And since this is pre-planned, that means that when you're releasing these first abilities, the first 4, you still know that later on down the track, the player will experience this. So even though right now you have already distributed all your 100 points between these 4, there's no reason not to redistribute them. So before we get to do that, we have to answer the question, okay, as game designers, how strong do we want to make these two? So is it going to be stronger than the sword? Is it going to be weaker? How much do we want the player to rely on these attacks based on the fact that we know that the sword is already the strongest one? So again, the answer here is completely up to you. You can make these two new ones weaker than the sword, as strong as the sword, or stronger than the sword, depending on the story you want to tell. So if you make these weaker than the sword, then you communicate that, look, this is new toys to play with. Perhaps they provide you with different utility than everything else right now. But if you want to go for top damage, the sword is still your option. If you make this as strong as the sword, then you communicate something like, look, these are just alternatives and you can use whichever is most convenient to you, but power-wise they're all the same. That's what the equal power usually communicates. And if these are stronger than the sword, it means that perhaps for this ninja, his training up to now meant that he had to master the sword, but now that he has already reached this level or reached the DLC content or whatever, now he's ready to move on to these more complicated but perhaps stronger weapons. So how much power you choose to give unmistakably tells its own story. And that's why I'm saying that you have to be very conscious and very deliberate about it. So in this case, let's stick with the idea that the sword is the strongest. And let's say that the nunchuck is going to be about a third of the power of the sword, and the kusarigama is going to be about 2/3 of the power of the sword, perhaps due to their other utility and whatnot. That is again up to you to decide. The easy part of doing it pre-planned is that we don't have to do any particularly difficult calculations here. We can just redistribute the points as we like. So for the punch, let's keep it at 10. For the kick, let's bump it down to 15. Shuriken can stay the same too. Sword, well, we want to normalize everything, right? So let's bring it a bit down, but still it's going to be much stronger than the others. And now we are up to 35, 45, 50, 60. We're up to 60 points, so we have 40 points to distribute between these two. So we said that we want the nunchuck to be about a third of the power. So maybe that's another 10. And we want the kusarigama to be about 2/3 of this power, so it's about 20. But let's bump these numbers up a little bit to make it feeling a bit better. Maybe something like 15 and 25. And this should all add again up to 100. So that's 40, 70, 75, 75, 85, 90, 100. Yes. So this is a way to redistribute all these values at this early stage without having to do any math at all. We just choose the values and we can make this redistribution very, very easily and basically decide the numbers that we want. We still have the opportunity here to change the numbers even more, right? So if we want to make, for example, this 20 and this 20, we can still do this. At this early stage, and if it's pre-planned, we have this great freedom where we basically get to choose whatever numbers we want. And the reason why I have just a dotted line here and not a hard line like here is because here we're just choosing these values right from the beginning, but we're just delaying when we will reveal these values to the player. While here, the reason why this line is not dotted and it's straight is because this will come later on and it's completely unknown. So we have no knowledge of this when we're working on this part. So let's dive there next and let's see how we would deal with assigning attack values to completely new abilities that nobody had planned for. So let's see how we can do that. Well, of course, one way to do it is to again decide values, right? That could be good. We could also just use the same method to say, well, again, let's say that these are completely new abilities. How do we want them to compare to the existing abilities of the player? Do we want them to be stronger, weaker, or equal strength? Again, it's up to us to decide. But let's stick with the same mentality that they're about 1/3 of the power for the nunchuck and about 2/3 of the power of the sword for the kusarigama. Now, I'm going to jump over there and I'm going to show you another super easy math method for deciding these values without having to do too much solving for x here and keeping things a bit more sane. So, up to now we were working based on 100 points total. So what we're going to do now is again work with the same 100 point total and apply it only to the new values. We're going to separate these 100 points to these two new values, and then we're going to normalize everything. And the normalization is going to be easier because since we just added 100 points to our original 100 points, then all we need to do is divide everything by 2, and we'll be back at 100 points again. But I will illustrate this specifically so you can see how it goes. So let's do. So this will now add up to 100. So we have 100% here and we have another 100 here. So if we wanted for the total to be 100 points total, then all we need to do is to divide everything by 2 and we'll be back at 100 points total. So let's go into that. Okay, that's the quick and dirty way to do it. Now let's add up and make sure that what we did here makes sense. So 5 plus 15 for these two is 20, plus 33 is 53, plus 17 is 60, 70? Yes, 70. And the final 33 puts us at 103. So we said before that we want the sword to still be strongest, so perhaps it's a good idea to bump this down a little bit, maybe put it down to 30. So here we're back again at 100 points. We normalized everything, so we still have all our values adding up to 100. And even though we didn't know anything about these two new abilities in the beginning, we made it so that we could basically incorporate them into our previous list of skills without too much trouble and without having to recalibrate the entire game, game balance wise. So because we use this technique here, if in the future we decide to add another 2 or another 10 abilities, we can still use the same method of just adding again the same total as we have now, just to the new ability set. So add another 100 points to the new ability set, distribute power there, and then divide again everything by 2, and we will still have everything adding up to 100. Of course, you can go and edit these manually as we did here if you see some numbers that don't quite express the power that you want to show for each ability. And this way of distributing things keeps the system very light and very playful, and it doesn't bog you down with too much math, and it does let you look at the whole list and see and think rather, am I happy with this power distribution, or is the game getting skewed to a direction I don't want? This is a very nice way to keep this organized and short. And because we know that we're always working on a 100% basis, it's easy to look at a number and know its role in the greater scheme of the power of the game. So is there a reason why we have to use 100% per se? No, we don't have to use 100%. We could use a very custom value like 555, or when we add a new attack here, just give it, I don't know, 37 more points to show that it's a little bit stronger than the sword and so on. But this will change our total, and then we have to keep that number in mind as well. Well, when we always work with 100%, then we know that when we look at a final number, then that's a percentage. So if I see this 30, I know it's 30% of the player's total power. So it's even easier to keep in mind. But if it works better for you to have a different total, that's of course completely fine. So that's it. That's the way to handle both pre-planned and not pre-planned additions to your move list or your ability list. And in the end, as a little bonus, I want to mention this. Often when we work on games and in game design, we have some really popular game as a base. We have this as a model in our mind, and we're saying we're making a game that looks like that popular game, but in our case, it's so and so and so different. Now, that's great to get us started because it puts an image in our mind, and it puts an image in the minds of everybody else who's listening to this conversation. But there's a very insidious danger here. You might get dragged into the tropes of that game without even realizing it. What do I mean by that? So let's say the game that you're using as a base has a main character, and that main character has 10 different weapons. So when you're working on your game, there is this unspoken assumption that in your game, the character will also have 10 weapons, when there is no reason for this to be the case. You can have as many as you want. You can have 5 or you can have 500 weapons. It's all about specifically what you decide to show, right? That is a very, very core driver in your decisions. There is no should, there is no how many weapons should there be, how much attack should something have. It's about how much you want it to have for the player to have the best experience possible. So when you're working with these abilities or abilities in your game, don't think that because other games have so and so 10 abilities or 5 abilities more or whatever, you have to have the same. That is completely not required. And as always, our top priority is providing our players with the best content possible. If that means more, then so be it. If that means less, so be it. The player's enjoyment is our priority. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope this helps you to navigate assigning attack values to various abilities, even if they're later on down the track, even if they're in a DLC, and specifically even if they're not planned at all. As always, thank you for your time and have fun.